From the moment Josh became an integral part of Lisa's life again, everything gradually began to change. At first, she tried to hold on to her familiar world: home, work, husband. It seemed that it was possible to cope with the surging feelings and suppress the growing attraction to Josh. In those moments when Josh was around, her life would come alive for a moment and then sink back into a grey routine. Lisa understood that her marriage to Mark had long since lost the energy that had once united them. But it wasn't until Josh returned that she began to realize the depth of the problem. Externally, nothing has changed. Mark still came home late, often tired and exhausted from work. He continued to live his usual life, but Lisa noticed that something was starting to leave their relationship. Perhaps it was because her feelings for him were no longer as strong as they used to be. Perhaps it was a natural process that happens with every marriage. But anyway, now their every evening was filled with a vague but tangible tension. Lisa felt more and more like a stranger in her own home. Previously, when Mark returned from work, she tried to create comfort, take care of him, cook dinner. She felt her role in this house as the keeper of their family hearth. But now everything has changed. Her movements became mechanical, as if she was performing her duties by inertia without putting any soul into them. The dinner she cooked every night now seemed tasteless to her, as did their conversations. Mark was immersed in his own affairs. He didn't talk much. But Lisa began to notice that he no longer showed the same interest in their common affairs. In the evenings, he increasingly went to his workshop or sat at the computer for a long time, pretending to work. Sometimes she could hear him talking on the phone with one of his colleagues, but these conversations seemed to her like background noise. Their communication was reduced to short phrases, routine questions and answers, as if they were two strangers who happened to be in the same house. One day, when Mark returned home, Lisa already knew that this evening would be the same as everyone else. She cooked dinner as usual, set the table, waiting for his arrival. But Mark was in no hurry to sit down at the table. He walked past her, glancing briefly at the food, as if he hadn't even noticed her efforts. Lisa felt a chill inside, as if something invisible had entered their house, causing them to distance themselves from each other even more. Mark quickly changed his clothes and went to his workshop, leaving Lisa alone. She sat at the table, staring at the plate of food, and felt her thoughts return to Josh. Every time she was alone, her mind began to fill with thoughts of him. It was stronger than her, as if something inside was tearing apart, demanding attention to these feelings. Lisa understood that her marriage with Mark was slowly falling apart, but she didn't know what to do about it. A few days passed, and things got even worse. Lisa noticed that Mark was getting late at work more and more often. If earlier he had at least sent messages warning that he would be late, now he did not even do that. Lisa tried to ignore it, telling herself that this was just a stressful period in his career, but inside she felt anxious. Something had changed in their relationship, and that something was subtle but tangible. One evening, Mark returned home later than usual. Lisa was not waiting for him, sitting down with a book in the living room. She decided that she would no longer try to hold his attention or try to return their previous relationship. It all seemed pointless to her. There was an awkward silence between them when he entered the house. Mark didn't say a word, just walked past her, giving her a look that had neither warmth nor concern. Lisa continued to read, pretending that she was not offended by his indifference, but everything was bubbling inside her. She understood that she could no longer live in such a state. Their life together became an empty formality, where each lived his own life without noticing the other. She tried to remember the last time Mark had looked at her with love or interest, but only fragments of their days together, full of household worries, came to mind. Over time, Mark began to leave for work earlier and return even later. Lisa was often left alone for the whole day, filling her time with random activities. The house that had once been filled with warmth now seemed cold and empty to her. She spent her days in silence, trying not to think about her problems, but thoughts of Josh did not leave her. It was hard for her to admit that her feelings for Josh were getting stronger, while her marriage to Mark was falling apart before her eyes. Mark stopped asking questions. If earlier he was interested in her affairs, asked how her day had gone, now his questions were reduced to those on duty. Is everything okay? Lisa answered in short sentences, not wanting to go into details. Her life became something that happened by itself, as if she was no longer a participant in it, but only an observer. Sometimes it seemed to her that Mark purposely avoided talking, as if he was afraid to find out the truth that lay behind their silence. One day Lisa noticed that Mark was spending less time at home, even on weekends. He always found something to do, then he'll go to his friends, then he'll take care of the car in the garage. Lisa understood that this was a form of escape from the reality in which they were both stuck. But she was afraid to admit that she was running too only from her own feelings. Mark may have started to suspect that something was wrong between them, but he didn't ask questions or make a scene. This estrangement became more and more palpable every day. In the evenings, Mark didn't touch her anymore. Their intimacy, which used to be a part of their lives, has become rare and formal. Even in those moments when they went to bed, Lisa felt that a wall had been built between them. He no longer looked at her the way he used to. His gaze was distracted, full of fatigue and indifference. Lisa knew that this was not just a crisis in the relationship, it was the end of their marriage. One morning, when Lisa was cooking breakfast, Mark came into the kitchen with a blank look. He sat down at the table, his face buried in the phone, and did not even look at her. It was already a familiar thing. They spent the morning hours in silence, each immersed in his own thoughts. But on this day, something changed. Lisa suddenly felt that she could no longer tolerate this silence.
Mark, we need to talk.
Mark looked up from the phone, frowning slightly, as if he hadn't expected to hear her voice.
About what?
She hesitated for a moment, not knowing where to start. It seemed to her that this conversation should have happened a long time ago, but she kept putting it off, hoping that everything would work out by itself. Now it was obvious that they could no longer continue to live the way they had before.
About us. About what's happening to us.
He sighed heavily and leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms over his chest. His gaze was tired and indifferent.
What's going on? We just live like we always do.
Lisa felt a wave of despair rising inside her. Her heart ached at the thought that Mark couldn't see what was going on between them. How could anyone not notice that their relationship was crumbling?
No, Mark. We don't live, we exist. You feel it yourself.
He stared at her in silence, and for a moment there was something like regret in his eyes. But this feeling quickly disappeared, giving way to a cold calmness. Mark didn't want to talk. It was easier for him to avoid conflict than to solve problems. It was part of his nature to walk away from unpleasant conversations, pretending that everything was fine.
I'm tired, Lisa. Maybe it's not about us, but just about work, about life.
Those words were the last straw for her. She couldn't take this indifference anymore. Their relationship has long been an empty shell, devoid of real intimacy. But despite all this, she felt like she was still trying to fix something, even if she didn't know exactly how. Mark got up from the table and headed for the door, leaving her alone. Lisa stared after him for a long time, not knowing what to do now. It took Lisa a moment to realize that their wedding anniversary was just around the corner. In recent months, the days had become a monotonous routine, and she had stopped following the calendar. Her life turned into a series of grey days that were no different from each other. Every day brought the same anxiety, mixed with guilt that her thoughts were filled not with Mark, but with Josh. But when she accidentally saw the date of their wedding on the calendar, something clicked inside her. She realized with horror that perhaps they had both forgotten about that day. The wedding anniversary has always been a special day for Lisa and Mark. In previous years, they would arrange a small party, exchange gifts, plan a weekend together, or have dinner at the restaurant they loved so much. It was their ritual, a symbol of their union, a reminder that despite all the difficulties of life, they were together, and their marriage was still based on some deep feelings. But now that Lisa realized that their anniversary was close, she felt a strange emptiness. This realization came when she stood at the window, looking out at the city, which had long been for her just the background of her complicated life. She looked up at the grey sky and reflected on how much everything had changed. Their marriage, which had once been strong, was gradually turning into an empty shell. Lisa no longer felt the closeness she once shared with Mark. And the thought that the anniversary was just another day for them only increased her pain. A few more days passed, but Mark still did not remember the approaching date. Lisa watched him with a kind of morbid curiosity, checking every day to see if his behavior would change, if he would have at least a hint of preparation for this event. But nothing changed. Mark continued to come home late, sometimes without even having time to have dinner, all the time referring to work, which seemed to have become for him not only an occupation, but also a refuge from reality. On the eve of the anniversary, Lisa was sitting in the kitchen, twirling her phone in her hands. She thought about reminding Mark of the day ahead, but something inside her resisted. An inner voice was saying that she shouldn't do anything. If he doesn't remember himself, it will only confirm how far they are from each other. Lisa decided that she would not take any action, but would just wait and see what would happen. It was their anniversary day. Lisa woke up early. There was an unpleasant feeling of heaviness in her chest, as if she had a premonition of something inevitable. She got up quietly so as not to wake Mark and went to the bathroom. In the mirror, her reflection seemed strange to her dull eyes, a tired face that had not had a joyful smile for a long time. She looked at herself for a long time, thinking about how much had changed in the last few years. Her marriage was slowly crumbling, and she herself was lost in the vortex of her own feelings and could not find a way out of this maze. Mark woke up later. He went out into the kitchen, giving Lisa a cursory glance. At that moment, she realized that he didn't remember the anniversary. He looked as usual, with the usual morning fatigue on his face, as if yesterday was an ordinary working day, and not the eve of their family holiday. Lisa looked at him, waiting for at least the slightest sign that he remembered something, but nothing happened. He quickly drank coffee, dropped a few phrases on duty that he was going to have a difficult day at work, and left, leaving Lisa alone. When the door closed behind him, Lisa remained sitting at the table, feeling a dull pain growing inside her. She expected disappointment, but she still wasn't ready for it. Their wedding anniversary, which used to be a symbol of their love, now became for her only a painful reminder of how far they had come from each other. She tried to convince herself that it was just a date, that it wasn't the numbers that mattered, but their feelings, but how could she deny the obvious? Mark forgot, and at the same time she realized that their marriage was finally bursting at the seams. Lisa spent the day all alone. She didn't know what to do, where to put herself. Thoughts of Josh overwhelmed her again. He had been her only comfort lately, the only person she felt alive around. But at the same time, the realization that her feelings for Josh had caused her to break up with Mark only increased her pain. She couldn't go to any of them, but she couldn't stay put either. Her life hung in some kind of strange limbo, where the past pulled her back, and the future seemed frightening and unclear. In the evening, Mark returned home later than usual. He looked tired and annoyed, as if the day hadn't gone the way he had planned. Lisa watched him, trying not to show that she expected something special from him. He walked into the living room, dropping his bag on the floor, and immediately turned on the TV. It was an ordinary evening in their house, silent, steeped in indifference and emptiness. Lisa no longer knew how to communicate with Mark. Their conversations were reduced to routine phrases, and any discussion of something serious seemed unnecessary and meaningless. Finally, Lisa couldn't stand it. She wasn't going to remind him about the anniversary, but the internal tension became unbearable.
Mark, do you know what day it is today?
Mark looked away from the TV for a moment, but his face remained unreadable.
No, why?
Those words hit her harder than she expected. She felt her insides tighten, but tried to hide her reaction. Mark didn't even try to remember. It didn't matter to him. And at that moment, Lisa realized that their marriage no longer existed. He was just a formality, a habit that neither of them could get rid of.
Today is our anniversary.
Mark froze for a moment, then his face became serious, but not upset, as if this news did not bring him any discomfort. He looked at Lisa, and there was not a shadow of regret or guilt in his eyes. He just didn't know what to say.
I'm sorry, I completely forgot. There was a lot of work.
He turned back to the TV as if the conversation was over. Lisa remained standing in the doorway of the living room, feeling anger and despair building inside her. Mark didn't even try to fix the situation, didn't offer anything that could soften this blow. Her heart was bursting with the realization that she was no longer important to him, that their relationship had long since lost its significance. The rest of the evening passed in deathly silence. Lisa was sitting in the bedroom, feeling a hurricane of emotions raging in her chest. She thought about Josh, how attentive he had been to her in recent months, how his support had helped her cope with loneliness and disappointment. At that moment, she realized that she could no longer stay in this marriage. Her feelings for Mark faded, and his indifference was the final blow to their relationship. Lisa knew that she would not be able to return to her old life, and this day finally confirmed her in this decision. A few days have passed. Lisa tried not to think about what had happened, but every time Mark returned home, she was overcome by a feeling of bitterness. He was no longer the person she wanted to be with. They lived under the same roof, but they were as far apart as ever. Lisa realized that Josh was now her only source of joy, but at the same time she realized that her relationship with him was impossible until she put all the dots over the I in her marriage. One evening, when Mark returned home late again and, as usual, went to the TV, Lisa made a decision. She couldn't put the conversation off any longer. They needed to talk about what was going on, that their marriage no longer existed, that they had become strangers to each other. Lisa felt that now, after everything that had happened, she had to go to the end, otherwise her life would turn into an endless chain of days full of pain and loneliness. When they sat down to dinner, Lisa decided to start a conversation.
Mark, we need to talk. I can't live like this anymore.
Mark looked at her in surprise, but there was no fear or excitement in his eyes. He seemed to have been expecting this conversation for a long time, but he didn't know how to start.
What do you want to say?
Lisa took a deep breath. It was hard for her to speak, but she knew it was necessary. She looked at Mark and realized that this man no longer made her feel the way she had before. Everything they had was gone, and she couldn't get it back.
I can't pretend anymore. You and I live like two strangers. You feel it yourself.
Mark nodded, but his face remained unreadable. He was silent, waiting for her to continue.
Our marriage hasn't been the same for a long time. I don't feel the connection I used to feel anymore. You can see for yourself that we have become estranged from each other, and I think it can't go on like this.
Mark didn't answer right away. He put down his fork and leaned back in his chair, looking thoughtfully at Lisa.
I know. But what do you suggest?
These words were spoken with cold determination. Lisa realized that this conversation was inevitable, and now they both have to make a decision about what will happen next. That evening, Lisa realized that her marriage with Mark had finally come to an end. After that forgotten anniversary, when Lisa finally realized that her marriage with Mark had been destroyed to the ground, her thoughts began to return to Josh more and more often. He became for her the very person who reawakened long-dead feelings in her, made her feel alive again. With each visit, with each meeting, she felt more and more attracted to him. However, these feelings did not bring her relief or peace of mind. On the contrary, they only aggravated her internal conflict. Lisa understood that her relationship with Josh had long gone beyond friendship. Once innocent meetings, conversations and laughter have now become saturated with hidden tension. Every time they were near, her heart began to beat faster, and her body began to react to his presence. She could no longer deny that their bond was much more than just friendship, but at the same time she didn't know how to deal with it. Lisa found herself thinking more and more often about what her future with Josh would be like. What if she could leave Mark and start all over again with a man who understood her, who made her happy? But despite all these dreams and fantasies, something inside her prevented her from taking this decisive step. There were too many obstacles: Mark, long years of marriage, guilt and fear of the unknown. And besides, she wasn't sure what Josh wanted. Every day, her inner conflict became more unbearable. Lisa knew she had to talk to Josh and find out how he saw their relationship. She needed to know how he felt in order to figure out how to build her life further. She could not continue to live in this limbo, being between two men, each of whom played an important role in her life. One day, after a particularly stressful day, Lisa decided that she couldn't put this conversation off any longer. She called Josh and asked to meet, without telling him anything specific, but making sure that he understood that it was important. They agreed to meet in the park, in the very place where they once walked as teenagers. At that moment, Lisa realized that she wanted to return the feeling of carelessness that they had then, but she understood that this was impossible. When they met, Lisa felt this indescribable tension building up inside her again. Josh, as usual, was calm, but there was something in his eyes that told her that he too felt that their relationship had long since crossed the line beyond which there was no way back. They started with the usual conversations about life, acquaintances and work, but Lisa couldn't keep it to herself anymore. She resolutely brought up the topic of their relationship, told him about her feelings, about how she was tormented by this contradiction between duty and desire. Lisa thought Josh would understand her, that he felt the same way too, but his reaction surprised her. He didn't answer right away, and at that moment Lisa realized that his silence meant more than any words. In the following days, their relationship began to change rapidly. Josh began to move away from Lisa. If before he was the source of her joy and comfort, now every meeting with him brought her pain and disappointment. He was no longer the Josh who brought lightness to her life. Coldness and aloofness appeared in his behavior. Lisa didn't understand what was going on, but she felt that he was avoiding her. Her heart ached with the fear of losing him. Josh began to write less often, skipping their meetings, referring to work or other business. Lisa didn't know how to handle it. She tried to talk to him about what was going on, but every time she brought it up, he evaded the question, found excuses, or simply remained silent. That silence hit her harder than any words. Lisa felt increasingly lonely. Now that her marriage to Mark had effectively ended, she realized that she was left alone, without the support she had found in Josh for so long. She couldn't believe that he could give up on her so easily. It seemed unfair. They had been through so much together, and Lisa couldn't accept the fact that their bond, which seemed so strong to her, could end like this without explanation and without saying goodbye. Every day without Josh seemed painful to her. She couldn't think of anything else but why he had changed, why he didn't want to be around her anymore. Lisa tried to get back to her normal life, but everything reminded her of Josh. Things, places, even random phrases in conversations with people, all this made her think about him. She knew she had gone too far, that her life would never be the same again, but she didn't know how to deal with it. The time they spent together now seemed distant and ghostly to her, like a dream that shouldn't have become reality. A few weeks later, Lisa made the final decision to talk to Josh. She needed to hear the truth from him, no matter how painful it turned out to be. She couldn't live in this state of uncertainty anymore. She made an appointment with him, but to her disappointment, Josh started avoiding the conversation again. He came to the meeting, but he behaved coldly and restrained, as if nothing had ever happened between them. At that moment, Lisa realized that their relationship was over. Josh was no longer the kind of person she could be honest and open with. She lost him the same way she had lost Mark, only this time it was even more painful, because she was hoping for something more. Her whole life, all her plans for the future were connected with him, and now those dreams have crumbled to dust. Lisa left the meeting feeling devastated. Her heart was broken, and she didn't know how to move on. Her relationship with Mark was ruined, and now she's lost Josh too. She was left alone with pain that seemed unbearable. Lisa couldn't believe that everything she had been through had led to such an outcome. She hoped for a new life, for love, but in the end she lost everything that was important to her. Now all she had to do was accept that her life would never be the same again. Josh became for her the person who awakened her feelings, but also the one who left her alone with those feelings without offering any solution. She could no longer rely on anyone but herself, and this realization was the hardest. Lisa spent her days thinking about what could have gone wrong. She tried to analyze every moment of their relationship, every conversation, every meeting. What did she do wrong? Why did Josh, who was so important to her, suddenly turn away from her? These questions haunted her, but there were no answers. Lisa felt that her life had now turned into a series of meaningless days, devoid of joy and hope. A few more weeks passed, and Lisa realized that Josh was leaving her life. His absence has become permanent. He no longer wrote, called, or offered to meet. She understood that this was the end, and every day her heart became more resigned to this fact, although the pain did not go away. Lisa realized that she had to accept this and move on, but she didn't know how. Everything that connected her to the past was now destroyed. Her life seemed to be plunged into darkness. Lisa didn't see the point of anything anymore. She had lost both her husband and her lover, and with them herself. Every morning began with her forcing herself out of bed, but there was no joy or hope in her actions. Everything that once seemed important to her has now lost its meaning. However, despite all the pain and disappointment, Lisa knew that she would have to find the strength to continue living. Her heart was broken, but she understood that time had to heal her wounds. She couldn't rely on Josh or Mark anymore. Now she had to rebuild her life, without them, without these men who had caused her suffering. The healing process was long and painful. Lisa slowly learned to accept reality for what it is. She no longer expected miracles from life, but she also realized that she could not let her grief completely consume her. Gradually, day by day, she began to find the strength to move on. Her path to a new beginning was difficult, but she knew it was the only path she had now. The conflict with Josh was Lisa's moment of realization that she could no longer rely on other people for her happiness. Now she had to search for him inside herself, and although it was difficult, she realized that there was no other way out. Lisa was left alone, but she knew that this was not the end, but only the beginning of her new path. Ever since Lisa and Josh crossed that invisible boundary, their lives seemed to have gone downhill. Each of their new contacts was riddled with tension that could no longer be ignored. At first they tried to act as if nothing had happened. Their meetings resembled rituals of the past, conversations about old friends, light jokes, memories of childhood. But there was no longer the ease that had been there before. Every time they were near, the air became heavy, full of unexpressed feelings and silent confessions. Lisa knew that her relationship with Josh would never be the same again. She was immersed in this connection, which now, after they crossed the line, became for her a source of excruciating pleasure and pain at the same time. Her life turned into a constant struggle with her own emotions. She tried to find solace in these rare meetings with Josh, but they only deepened her inner conflict. Her marriage to Mark had collapsed, and now only Josh was left, but with him, too, things were getting more complicated and confusing. Every time Josh came to their house, Lisa couldn't help but feel this strange tension. He stayed the night, but now his presence in the house became even more difficult for her. Mark, as usual, was immersed in his own affairs, and often did not even notice how long Josh stayed with them. For him, Josh was a friend, a part of their past, and he did not suspect that their friendship had long ago turned into something much more. But Lisa felt on the edge, as if her life was about to collapse completely. One night, when Josh stayed with them again, Lisa couldn't sleep. She was lying in bed next to Mark, listening to his calm breathing, but her thoughts were far from him. All day she had been trying to ignore the tension that was growing by the hour, but now, in the silence of the night, it became unbearable. Lisa felt like she couldn't keep it to herself anymore. She knew Josh was in the living room, whether he was asleep or just lying in the dark, thinking like she was. Lisa got out of bed and quietly left the bedroom, trying not to wake Mark. She walked to the living room door, her heart racing. In the darkness of the room, Josh's outline could be seen lying on the couch. Lisa stopped on the threshold, feeling an indescribable tension engulf her. She couldn't explain why she took this step, why she was attracted to him, but at that moment she couldn't stop. The silence was deafening. Lisa stood there, not daring to come closer, but at the same time she couldn't leave. Something inside her was breaking. All her moral principles, duty, guilt, all this receded into the background. At that moment, only one thing was important to her: to be near him, to feel his presence, which became for her a source of strange comfort and at the same time fear. She knew that this step would change everything, that their relationship would no longer be the same, but she couldn't stop herself. She came closer, feeling her breathing become ragged. 1,000 thoughts swarmed through her head: that she was betraying Mark, that Josh might not feel the same way about her, that their friendship, which they had cherished for so long, was now destroyed. But despite all these thoughts, she was attracted to him, and she couldn't do anything about it. Josh was her salvation and her curse at the same time. He was the one who brought her back to life when she felt cornered by her own problems and disappointments. But at the same time, he became the cause of her inner rupture, which now could not be ignored. Lisa knew that if she took another step, she would never be able to return to her old life. She stopped in front of the sofa, feeling her heart about to jump out of her chest. Josh didn't move, but Lisa knew he wasn't asleep. There was a silence between them, filled with all the things they couldn't say out loud. She felt this tension on a physical level. It was pressing on her, making her breathe heavily and unevenly. It was a tension that they had both felt over the past few months, but which could not find a way out. That night was a turning point for Lisa. She couldn't pretend everything was okay anymore. Her feelings for Josh overwhelmed her, and she couldn't fight it. Her life, which had been full of uncertainty and suffering until that moment, now turned into a maze from which there was no way out. She was trapped in this triangle between Mark and Josh, and each new day only brought her more pain. After that night, everything changed. Josh became even more distant. He no longer came as often as he used to, and if he did, their conversations became even more strained. Lisa didn't know how to trust him now. She felt that something had broken between them. The lightness they felt at the beginning disappeared, giving way to a heavy silence that increasingly corroded their relationship. Every time Lisa was alone, her thoughts went back to that night. She felt crushed. Her relationship with Mark had been doomed for a long time, but now she realized that things were not so simple with Josh either. She couldn't look at him as a friend anymore, but at the same time, she didn't know what to do with what had arisen between them. Their connection, which seemed so meaningful to her, has now become a source of excruciating suffering for her. It's been a few weeks. Lisa tried to avoid Josh, but every time they were around, there was that same tension between them that they both felt but couldn't put into words. Their meetings became rare, and each time they ended in silence that spoke more than any words. Lisa understood that their friendship had long ceased to exist. In its place, there was only this heavy, inevitable attraction that she could not suppress. Mark, as usual, did not notice what was going on inside Lisa. He was immersed in his work, in his problems, and Lisa realized that she had not been an important part of his life for a long time. He lived in his own world, and she lived in hers. They were two strangers who happened to be under the same roof. Lisa tried to get back to her usual life, but every time she thought about Josh, her heart broke. One night Lisa couldn't sleep again. She lay in the dark, staring at the ceiling, and felt a growing sense of unease inside her. It was the same feeling she felt every time she thought about Josh. She couldn't live in this uncertainty anymore. She needed to change something, but she didn't know where to start. Lisa understood that she could no longer continue her relationship with Josh in this form, but at the same time she did not know how to live without him. That night was the beginning of the end for Lisa. She realized that she couldn't ignore her feelings anymore, but she couldn't be with Josh either. She was crushed by this conflict which was tearing her apart. She felt trapped between the past and the present, between duty and desire. And every day this trap got closer and closer. In the following days, Lisa no longer tried to find solace in Josh. She avoided him, didn't answer his calls and texts. She needed time to sort herself out, to figure out what she really wanted. But there was still this feeling inside of her that wouldn't let her rest. She knew that her life would never be the same again, that her relationship with Mark was already over, and with Josh it would never start the way she wanted it to. This night meeting became a point of no return for Lisa. She couldn't go back to what she was before anymore. Her life had been ruined, and now she had to put herself back together, but she didn't know how to do it. When Lisa first crossed the line between friendship and something more with Josh, she knew it would inevitably change her life. However, she could not predict how devastating the consequences of this betrayal would be. At first, it seemed to her like a passing infatuation, a way to escape from the suffocating routine and emotional emptiness of her marriage to Mark. But the deeper Lisa got into her relationship with Josh, the more her life began to fall apart. At first, Lisa tried to keep everything under control, convincing herself that this was a temporary crisis. She thought she could handle the situation, that her marriage to Mark could still be saved if she just pretended that nothing had happened. At one point, she even believed that she could bring back her old feelings for Mark and close the door to the past, which was increasingly associated with Josh. But as the days passed, reality became increasingly grim and unforgiving. After that night with Josh, Lisa noticed that her behavior with Mark had changed. She couldn't look at him with the same tenderness anymore, couldn't touch him without feeling guilty. Every time Mark tried to get close to her, whether it was a conversation or ordinary household chores, she felt that an invisible wall had grown between them. Her heart no longer responded to his touch. Now all her thoughts were on Josh, what had happened between them, and what could have happened. Lisa began to avoid Mark, becoming more and more immersed in her own thoughts and feelings. She found various excuses to spend less time together. If earlier they had at least tried to maintain the appearance of a normal life, now Lisa was more and more withdrawn into herself. The evenings they used to spend together became filled with painful silence. Lisa was no longer interested in what was going on in Mark's life, and he, in turn, seemed not to notice her inner struggle. Her breakup with him had been a slow, painful process that had been going on for months, but now it was obvious even to herself. Every morning, waking up next to Mark, Lisa felt a strange heaviness in her soul. Her thoughts were full of contradictions. On the one hand, she couldn't forgive herself for betraying him, but on the other, she couldn't ignore her feelings for Josh. Every day began with a struggle with myself, with trying to convince myself that this was just a temporary confusion, that everything would get better soon. But the more she tried to convince herself of this, the more intense her inner tension became. Mark didn't seem to suspect anything. He was still as engrossed in his work as before. Sometimes he stayed late at the office or at meetings with colleagues, and sometimes he returned home late at night when Lisa was already asleep. Their conversations boiled down to simple, mundane things: shopping, weekend plans, household issues. But Lisa understood that she could no longer support this farce. She felt empty, crushed by internal conflicts. The longer her secret relationship with Josh continued, the more she realized that she had lost control of the situation. Initially, everything seemed so simple. She just wanted to feel alive, to regain those emotions that were missing in her marriage with Mark. But now everything has become more complicated. Josh had become more than just a comfort or a romantic intrigue for her. Her feelings for him were getting deeper and deeper, but at the same time they were causing her more and more pain. Josh also began to notice the changes in Lisa. He could feel her inner struggle, her doubts. Although they didn't talk about it directly, the silence between them became even more difficult. Lisa didn't know how to tell him about her fears, that she felt torn in two. She could no longer enjoy their meetings, because behind every moment of joy there was an unbearable weight of guilt in front of Mark. Over time, Lisa began to realize that her relationship with Josh was also going through a crisis. If before they could easily communicate, now their every conversation was full of innuendo and hidden feelings. Lisa noticed how Josh began to avoid her. He was no longer the same as before. Their meetings became less frequent, and his behavior became more restrained. Lisa couldn't understand what was happening to him. It seemed to her that he also felt guilty about what had happened between them, but did not know how to deal with it. One evening Lisa returned home and realized that she could no longer live like this. She sat alone in the living room for a long time, thinking that her life had turned into an endless series of sufferings. Her marriage to Mark was effectively dead, but she couldn't bring herself to admit it. Her relationship with Josh was also becoming more and more painful, but she couldn't let him go. Lisa found herself in a trap from which she saw no way out. The consequences of treason began to manifest themselves in everything. Lisa began to lose control not only of her feelings, but also of her life in general. She began to sleep worse. She was tormented by constant nightmares in which she saw Mark and Josh together and could not choose which of them she should leave in her life. She became distracted, forgetful, unable to focus on anything. Even the simplest household chores irritated her. Over time, Lisa began to notice that Mark began to look at her more closely. Perhaps he suspected something, but did not dare to ask a direct question. He asked her more and more often about her day, how she was feeling. But Lisa couldn't tell him the truth. Each of his questions seemed to her like a trap that she could fall into if she answered incorrectly. She tried to avoid these conversations, but it was getting harder every day. Mark, despite his immersion in work, began to notice that their relationship had changed. He tried to get closer to Lisa, but she pulled away from him in every possible way. He saw her closeness, her coldness, but did not understand what caused such a change. Sometimes Mark tried to arrange a romantic dinner or offered to spend the weekend together, but Lisa refused, citing fatigue or other business. She couldn't be around him anymore, knowing that she had betrayed him. One of the most painful moments for Lisa was the realization that she had lost not only Mark, but also Josh. If before he had been a source of joy and comfort to her, now their meetings have become painful for her. Josh began to appear less and less in her life, and every time they saw each other, Lisa felt that their relationship no longer brought her joy. He became even more distant, and Lisa understood that he did not see a future for their relationship either. After one of their rare dates, Lisa realized that she could no longer continue this relationship. She couldn't be with Josh, but she couldn't go back to Mark either. Her life had completely lost its meaning. She felt crushed, didn't know how to move on. Everything she did seemed empty and meaningless to her. Her job, her home, her relationships, all this has become something alien and unnecessary for her. Lisa understood that she needed to make some kind of decision. She could no longer remain in this state of uncertainty, but the fear of the unknown paralyzed her. She was afraid to ruin her life completely, but she understood that if she did not change anything, she would die in this mental anguish. Every day was a challenge for her. Every evening she spent alone, thinking about what had gone wrong. There came a moment when Lisa realized that she needed to talk to Mark. She couldn't live a lie anymore. She needed to confess to him what had happened, even if it would ruin their marriage completely. Lisa knew he deserved the truth, and she couldn't take it any longer. But no matter how hard she tried to prepare for this conversation, something stopped her every time. She was afraid to see his reaction, afraid of his anger, disappointment, pain. When she finally decided to talk, there was a strange feeling of emptiness inside her. She knew that this conversation would be the end of their life together, but at the same time she felt strangely relieved at the thought that she would no longer have to lie. She had been waiting for this moment for weeks, and now it seemed inevitable to her. That evening was the hardest for Lisa in her life. She gathered all her strength to finally tell Mark the truth, but his reaction was even more painful than she expected. The moment that Lisa had been dreading for so long had arrived. She could no longer hide behind the daily routine and pretend that nothing was happening. Her life was slowly falling apart, and she realized that she simply couldn't stay in this lie anymore. The internal conflict that had been gnawing at her over the past months had reached its climax. Everything she had so carefully hidden from Mark had now come out, and she had to face the consequences of her choice. Lisa has been putting off this moment for a long time. She was afraid of destroying not only her marriage, but everything that she and Mark had built together. The memories of how happy they had been at the beginning of their relationship tormented her like ghosts of the past, from which it was impossible to escape. But now those memories seemed distant and alien, as if she was no longer the woman who had once loved Mark. Everything had changed, and Lisa could no longer ignore the truth. Her relationship with Josh, which had once seemed like a source of comfort and new sensations, now brought her only pain and disappointment. They crossed the boundaries of friendship, and it changed everything. Josh was no longer that easy, joyful person with whom you could just relax and forget about problems. His presence in her life was a reminder that she had betrayed Mark, betrayed their marriage, and now she would have to pay for her mistakes. Lisa felt that she had lost not only Mark but Josh as well. They both drifted away from her, leaving her alone with painful thoughts. All this time, Lisa was trying to cope with the guilt that was eating her up from the inside. She knew that her actions had led to the destruction of their marriage, but she couldn't figure out how to deal with this feeling. A storm was raging inside her, which did not abate for a minute. Her life became a series of sleepless nights and painful thoughts. She couldn't hide her feelings anymore, but at the same time she didn't know how to tell Mark the truth. One evening, when Mark returned home, Lisa realized that she could no longer put off this conversation. She sat in the kitchen, thinking about how to start, but the words wouldn't come. Her hands were shaking, and her heart was pounding so hard that it seemed like she was about to lose consciousness. Lisa knew that this conversation would be the end of everything she knew, the end of their marriage, the end of her old life. Mark looked tired, as he always did after a long day at work. He didn't notice her tense state, just walked past her, ignoring her. It was an ordinary evening for them, full of silence and alienation. Lisa stared at him for a long time, trying to gather the strength to finally tell the truth, but fear held her back. She was afraid of his reaction, afraid that this conversation would ruin not only their marriage, but also their lives. Her thoughts went back to Josh, to how it all started. These meetings with him seemed so innocent to her at first, almost accidental. She sought solace in him, wanting to find in his presence something she had not found in Mark for a long time. But this relationship grew into something more, and Lisa couldn't handle it anymore. Josh became a source of joy and pain for her at the same time. Now his absence from her life tormented her, but at the same time she understood that everything ended with him the same way as with Mark. Lisa took a deep breath and finally decided to have this conversation. Her voice trembled as she started to speak, but she knew there was no other way out. She told Mark everything. Her confession was excruciating. She could feel her heart tearing apart with every word, but she couldn't stop. Everything she was hiding came out. Mark listened to her in silence, without interrupting, but his face changed as she talked. Lisa saw how his eyes had dimmed, how his features had become stony, and his breathing was ragged. She knew this conversation would hurt him, but she couldn't lie anymore. She couldn't go on living this lie anymore. When she finished, there was a heavy silence in the room. Lisa waited for his reaction, but Mark didn't say a word. His face remained impenetrable, but in his eyes Lisa saw what she feared most of all: disappointment and emptiness. He got up from the table and went into the bedroom, leaving her alone in the kitchen. Lisa sat in place for a long time, not knowing what to do. She understood that this moment was the end of their marriage. The next morning, Mark packed up his things and left. He didn't say a word. Lisa knew it was his decision, and she couldn't stop him. She was left alone in their empty house, realizing that now her life would never be the same. Everything they had built together, all their years of marriage, all their plans for the future, it was all ruined. Lisa understood that she would no longer be able to return to the life they had led together. Now she had to live alone, and this realization was both frightening and liberating for her. In the first days after Mark left, Lisa felt lost. She wandered around the house, not knowing what to do. Things that used to bring her joy now seemed meaningless. Every corner of the house reminded her of Mark, of what she had destroyed. Her heart was heavy with guilt, and Lisa didn't know how to deal with this feeling. She often looked at the phone, hoping that Josh would call or text, but he also disappeared from her life. Josh, upon learning that Lisa confessed to Mark, began to distance himself even more from her. He didn't want to be the reason for the destruction of her marriage, and this realization weighed on him. Lisa felt that she had lost not only her husband, but also Josh. He had become a part of her past that she could no longer bring back. She was left alone, and this loneliness scared her. Every day Lisa realized more and more that her life should be different now. Her marriage to Mark ended, and with it ended most of the life she had known. She could no longer live in the past, but the future seemed unclear and frightening to her. Lisa realized that now she would have to start all over again, but did not know how to do it. Her loneliness has become a new challenge for her. It took Lisa a long time to come to terms with the fact that she was left alone. She spent days in silence, thinking about what had happened, what had brought her to this moment. She tried to find answers to her questions, but each time she came to the same conclusion: her decisions led to the destruction of her life, and now she will have to live with these consequences. Lisa realized that her life would never be the same again. She lost Mark, she lost Josh, but most importantly, she lost herself. Everything she knew about herself now seemed alien and unnecessary to her. Her old life, her dreams, her plans, all this is in the past. Now there was only a void in front of her, which she had to fill anew. It took several months before Lisa began to rebuild herself. She was gradually getting used to her new status as a woman who had lost everything. Her life became different, but with it came the realization that she was now free. Lisa was no longer tied to the past, to obligations to Mark, or feelings for Josh. Now she had to build a new life. Lisa began to seek solace in simple things: long walks in the fresh air, reading books that she had been putting off for a long time, and meeting friends whom she had not seen for a long time. She knew it would take time to recover, but it was her way. She needed to learn to live anew, without attachment to the people who used to make up her world. Over time, Lisa realized that her life, despite all the destruction, is still full of possibilities. She no longer felt obligated to anyone, and it gave her a sense of lightness. Her future was full of uncertainty, but with it, prospects. Lisa realized that now she can build her life anew, on her own terms, without fear of what happened in the past. The denouement of her relationship with Mark and Josh was a painful but necessary lesson for Lisa. Now she knew that she could not build her happiness on lies or betrayal. She had to go through losses to realize that her real strength was inside herself. And now that everything was over, Lisa was ready to start a new chapter in her life, filled with awareness of her own mistakes and willingness to change.